Begin transmission. The date is March 18th, 3020. The time is 2300 hours. I am Dr. Jeremy Bloschke, xenobiologist, ID number 7814. It has been a little less than a day since we've landed on the surface, and today has been one of the most exciting days of my life, spent exploring the surrounding area. We found this little creature right outside our habitat, exploring a little rotten log. A remarkable, very strange looking creature. And one of the most fascinating things about this creature is it's reminiscent of what we can see on Earth, at least in our ancient histories. So one of the most pressing questions about a mission like this is, if there is life on another planet, does it look similar to what life used to look like on Earth? If so, that's quite remarkable, and why would it be so? So far, it looks like this planet and the life that Earth used to have are quite similar. Not all creatures are cute and cuddly, though. Dave was telling me, I haven't confirmed this, this is a story from Dave, but Dave was telling me that there are these little tiny flying creatures with spears, and they will stab themselves into your arm, and once they're embedded into your muscle tissue, their lower half swells with your blood, and then they fly away. I don't know what they're doing with your blood. Dave is quite concerned, but again, this is unconfirmed. I will be doing more investigations. What I can confirm is that right outside our habitat, there are a remarkable number of tiny little creatures. They seem to have 6 little legs, and they run around quite rapidly, marching in single file, one after the other. And my pet name for them at the moment are myrmidons, after those mythological Greeks who would go into battle. Before they went into battle, they would take their soldiers by the feet and dip them in molten metal, and then once encased in the molten metal, they would give them shards of metal to stab their enemies with. That's what these little creatures reminded me of. They have a very hard armor-like plating around their bodies, and their little stabby things are in their butts. So in the front end, if you poke them and pester them too much, they will snap you with these giant jaws, and then bring their butt around and stab you with something. Quite unpleasant. I can confirm that from personal experience. So I'll be watching these myrmidon creatures quite closely over the coming days. There are far too numerous species for me to discuss all at once, so I think the best way to do this is to think systematically about it. I will go out and collect and document, describe, and then I'll come back, put together a presentation on a specific group of animals, convey them to you, so that when you join me here, you will have a good background on the biology of this particular planet. The wonderful news is you now have something to anticipate. You are actually working towards a purpose. We know that there is life out there, and that you will soon be joining me here. So best of luck in your studies. I will organize these presentations every few days as best I can, and then deliver them to you. Have a wonderful morning. In stories of ancient Earth, there are legends of a holiday called Christmas, where people would go out and chop down trees during the winter and bring them inside. These trees were usually pine trees, and then were covered in ornaments and decorations, and then it was a celebration of life and the birth of what some considered to be the savior of the world. I tell this story because these creatures that I encountered in the marine ecosystem reminded me of those Christmas trees. So I'm calling these creatures Christmas tree worms. And at first they look like individual animals, but they always come in pairs. And when I poked one, both little Christmas trees retracted. They are embedded in this coral, very much like the coral we have on Earth. Kind of convergent evolution, it seems. Pretty remarkable at that. But these Christmas trees actually are like little modified tentacles that belong to a much longer worm that is embedded inside the coral reef. So I'm calling these the Christmas tree worms, and the group they belong to, the worms, the segmented worms, or annelids. Annelids have all kinds of diversity. The ones I've seen so far, there are marine forms that are quite beautiful, elaborate structures on their sides, bristles and setae that are used for locomotion and movement and for deterring predation. Some of my favorites that we encountered just yesterday morning, this bright green one on the coral reef. It was hunting for prey, presumably. This bright red one, very different in color and structure, but you can see that they all have segments and they all have extensions, lateral extensions off their body. Our botanist has quickly become an expert in what she's calling soil worms. These soil worms, at first glance, don't look much like the marine worms I was encountering, but when we look closer, I see some significant similarities. These obviously don't have the elaborate bristles that their marine relatives have, but you can clearly see the rings and the segments. What our botanist has told me is that these are plentiful in the ground and especially around plants, and seem to be doing some kind of positive ecosystem engineering for the soil. They come out at night, drag leaves and other topsoil back down, and so seem to be important for recycling nutrients. So we have some positive benefits, ecological benefits of these segmented worms. Some of them look quite nice, but are actually quite harmful. This one looks like one of those soil worms, but it has an extensible pharynx of some kind with 4 teeth on it, which is very much not like a soil worm. I'm not sure what kind of creature this is, but it is somewhat disturbing and very much not like what we have on Earth. Also, something that we do not have on Earth are these worms here. I'm calling them bobbit worms. These bobbit worms, the largest specimen I saw yesterday, was 10 feet long, although it was still only about 3 inches in diameter. They have interlocking jaws. They will lock in place, snap into place, and then they have tentacles that rest in the water waiting for prey to pass by. And here you can see this, this video of some type of large vertebrate coming close, and the bobbit worm drags his prey beneath into his lair. Quite disturbing, in fact. And I'll show it one more time. The interlocking jaws snap into place. They seem to be on some kind of hair trigger. So as soon as the tentacles sense the either a chemical smell or vibration from the water of their prey, they can reach out and grab it. If these creatures were any larger, I might be more concerned that this planet is not suitable for human habitation after all. The one thing that, there are 2 traits, actually, that all these annelids have in common, whether they're the bobbit worms or the marine bristle worms or the soil worms that our botanist found. They all have segments, and these segments are individualized, each carrying organs in each segment, and they all have paired epidermal setae. So in the soil worms, they're quite reduced and small, but in the other ones, they're quite large. So the segmentation is called metamerism, and the segments are surrounded by circular muscles that can contract and elongate the segment, and also longitudinals that when they contract, they shorten and widen the segment. So using this system of fluid-filled chambers, they can change their shape but not their volume, and this allows them to burrow through the soil or creep along the surface of a coral reef or swim through the water. And the second synapomorphy of annelids, the second unique defining character trait, are these paired epidermal setae. In the marine worms, they're quite obvious, and they stick off these fleshy projections called parapodia. Sometimes they're very long, sometimes they're short, sometimes there's many of them, sometimes there's only a few. Often they're brightly colored, and some of them have given rashes to members of our crew, so I think these bright colors are probably aposematic. they indicate toxicity. But regardless, there's of the modifications and diversification of this group, they all have a metameric body plan and paired epidermal setae. I collected many different specimens over the past day and quickly ran a phylogenetic tree of this. This is absolutely possible because it is the year 3020 and we have instant genomic sequencing, and I have a super advanced future brain. So the phylogenetics of annelids, I've grouped them into a single phylum, Annelida. Within there, I'm going to discuss two classes primarily. Those classes are going to be the Aurantians and the Sedentarians. The Aurantians are primarily free-moving worms, and the Sedentarians are primarily sedentary, but there is a lot of exceptions within there, as we will discuss. The relationships between all these taxa are a lot more complicated than I initially expected. Initially, I grouped them all because of their metameric body and their paired epidermal setae, and which leaves out these poor subpunculans here because they neither have setae nor internal separations in their body segments. So even though they look very much worm-like. The relationships within Sedentaria can be quite complicated as well. I'm not 100% sure how everybody is related to each other. But this is the overview of how they're related genetically to each other. The morphology of annelids, at least externally, some of them don't have any kind of jaw that's visible at all. Others have quite elaborate jaw structures and have some kind of fingernail-like material called chitin that they make their jaws from. Their jaws are typically, if present, are on the end of an extensible proboscis, or pharynx. So we saw the pharynx of that soil worm-like creature that's not actually a soil worm. It had a pharynx with jaws on the end that it could stick out of its head. Its head itself has two components, a prostomium and a peristomium. The prostomium, there are two palps on the prostomium, and these palps are highly modified in different marine worms, especially the Christmas trees of our little friends, the Christmas tree worms, are actually modifications of prostomial palps. They're often tentacles for sensing water current, and they're filled with mechanoreceptors and chemosensory organs. And the peristomium is the segment immediately posterior to the prostomium. I also want to point out the pygidium, which is the terminal segment, the very final segment on the posterior end of the worm. The pygidium is what actually makes new segments. So new segments are formed anterior to the pygidium. Therefore, the youngest part of the worm is on the posterior end. This is in contrast to what we see in tapeworms on Earth, where tapeworms, the youngest part is near the head on the anterior end. So it's the opposite of that. You can also see these fleshy extensions called Parapodia. These have been secondarily lost in the soil worms, the terrestrial soil worms, but in marine worms they're quite elaborate structures. And if we zoom in on the Parapodia here, we see there's actually two different structures, the nodopodium on the dorsal side and the neuropodium on the ventral side. I'm calling it the neuropodium. Podus means foot, so that's where that comes from. Neuro, because they have this setae, this elongated ossiculum, which I think is heavily involved in sensing the ground and sensing chemicals in the water. If we dissect the nodopodium, we see it's completely filled with very small respiratory capillaries. I'm assuming they're respiratory. There are no obvious respiratory organs on the inside of these annelids, and I think part of the reason why they have these very thin adaptations, the Parapodia extending from their sides, is so that they can breathe. So they're very thin, lots of surface area, highly vascularized, and oxygen and carbon dioxide can diffuse in and out of the Parapodia. A more simplified structure of the soil worm. I want to point out that these are eucoelomate animals. They have a true coelom, so this is in contrast to the flatworms of Earth. The coelom, we can tell it's a true coelom because it's surrounded by these peritoneal membranes. We have a visceral peritoneum surrounding the digestive cavity and a parietal peritoneum on the inside of the muscle tissue. Inside, then, is the coelom, and the coelom in annelids is fluid-filled, so it gives them a hydrostatic skeleton. At the junction of each segment, you have the two peritoneums join, and you form something called a septum, which is a much stronger, thicker membrane. Traversing the septa are your dorsal and ventral blood vessels, your intestines, and your nerve cords. Otherwise, all your organs are repeated in every body segment. Classification of the Phylum Annelida. We have two primary classes, the errant worms and the sedentary worms. Within class Sedentaria, there is a unique group called Spoonworms that I'm placing in family Echiridae. And then the soil worms and their relatives are also pretty unique. I'm going to place them in order Clitellata, and there's a specific predatory group of predatory and parasitic group of soil worms that I'm going to call Hyrudinids. And so they get their own unique families, family Hyrudinidae. Phylum Annelida contains two large classes, class Aurantia and class Sedentaria. We'll talk about each one in turn. During our exploration of the marine environment, we found an abundance of annelids present. When they were crawling along the bottom of the ocean floor, like this strange-looking Aurantian here, they're termed benthic. So benthic Aurantians are found on the ocean floor. We also spent some time just wandering through the open ocean, and rather than being devoid of life, as most of the oceans on Earth are, at least now, when we got deeper into the ocean, it got darker and darker and darker until all light was lost. And when we turned off the searchlights on our Nautilus, we saw an abundance of bioluminescent organisms. Reminded me of the extinct Acoria victoria, from which we got our green fluorescent protein. Our oceans on Earth are now largely devoid of bioluminescent life, but this ocean is still flourishing with it. All of these organisms that are floating in the ocean are called pelagic. Pelagic in contrast to benthic. So benthic living on the ocean floor, pelagic living in the open ocean. Aurantians have both benthic and pelagic forms. One of the strangest pelagic forms is this creature here. So in all the beautiful bioluminescent jellyfish and worms that were floating before our eyes, we saw this, what looks to be a disembodied butt flying through the ocean. We captured a few of them, and I think it's an annelid. So we can see the segments there, and I think the individual segments are actually just the middle segments are inflated with a gas, and this creates a neutral buoyancy, and I think the worm has the ability to add and subtract gas from its middle segments. This can allow it to float or sink based on where it wants to be in the water column. Still, a very, very strange creature. Definitely not something we would have on Earth, for sure. In the pelagic forms, they primarily use their setae to move through the ocean with alternating waves of muscular contractions. It's quite mesmerizing, quite graceful, and beautiful. Reproduction in Aurantians is quite strange. We're familiar with broadcast spawning on Earth with sponges and some cnidarians, where the males and females will release their sperm and eggs into the water all at once and time it. Well, this works because they're sedentary organisms, but Aurantians are free living, and so with most free living organisms, they're dioecious. Sexes are separate, and they find each other to mate. But Aurantians, I have a feeling they're delicious. I haven't tried tasting them yet, but I noticed that they are often among the most commonly eaten organisms in the marine environment, and so I think they live a dangerous life. And if you're in a Rantian worm and you have a nice, cozy coral cave, you don't want to leave to go find a mate. And so I'm calling these Pololo worms. These Pololo worms have a very unique adaptation to avoid leaving their homes to find a mate. The worm itself is called an atoke, and generally, for most of its life, it will have no reproductive organs to speak of. But during the breeding season, the atoke develops this other segment on the posterior end called an epitoke. The epitoke contains all of its gametes, and what happens then is that the atoke and the epitoke detaches. The epitoke detaches from the atoke and swims off on its own and joins other epitokes from other Pololo worms in a giant mating swarm, and they reproduce. So this remarkable adaptation allows the atoke, the actual organism, to stay safe in its little cozy cave, while its reproductive organ goes off and reproduces with other reproductive organs in the open ocean. This is quite remarkable. Very unique strategy for reproduction. In contrast, sedentarians are sedentary primarily, and the marine world here seems to be full of nutrients, very different than the kind of dull, lifeless oceans we have on Earth now. And the nutrients in the ocean supports a great array of life. Most of these life forms tend to be sedentary, and filter feeding the water for these organic nutrients seems to be a very common mode of life. Sedentarians can be grouped by how they feed. So we'll talk about ciliary feeders first. And these are organisms like the fan worms, and fan worms secrete a really interesting parchment tube. Some of them make it from parchment-like protein that they secrete themselves. Others secrete a mucus and join sand grains into it, so you make a hard case of sand. But regardless, they live inside, and then they have a tentacular crown filled with radioles. And these radioles have very high surface area to mass ratio, and they're filled with little cilia on these grooves. As the debris falls on them, or as they wave through the water, little bits of organic particles get stuck in their little pinnules and transferred into the food grooves. And then inside the food grooves, you have little tiny cilia that wave all these little bits down to their mouth. Quite remarkable. We see a very similar kind of eating in many sea anemones on Earth. Particularly this parchment tube reminds me of Cerianthus. We also have deposit feeders. Deposit feeders are very difficult to find, actually. Here is a picture of one, and you can see that most of the body is embedded in the soil itself. And its tentacles are spread along the surface, and as the nutrients fall onto the surface of the ocean, they are caught in these little troughs of their tentacles. And again, just like with the ciliary feeders, they have little cilia in these tentacles that ferry the food to their mouth. So these are obviously benthic, sedentary feeders. On the beaches, we saw these mysterious sand casings all over the beach. When I dug them up, I found something I'm calling lugworms. Lugworms have very reduced parapodia, so they kind of look very similar to the soil worms. So these are kind of the soil worms of the sea. And they dig these tunnels in the beach and then pump water into them. As the water flows across their gills, they respire. The gas exchange occurs here. And then the water flows this direction and into the sand. The sand actually filters the water for organic nutrients for them. So lugworms, sand filterers, they don't have cilia, they don't have tentacles. Instead, they let the sand do all the filtering for them, and then they eat the sand and excrete it out to their posterior end. And that is the casings you see here, is sand that has been eaten, cleaned of its organic debris, and then excreted by the lugworms. This is very similar to how scaphopods eat, the kind of dentalium and friends on Earth. They kind of eat the food that the sand has filtered for them. Deep on the ocean, we discovered a tremendously large skeleton of some unknown creature that I'm hoping is not a predator, because it was at least 60 feet long. But embedded in the skeleton of this creature were these little threadworms that I'm calling beard worms, threadworms or beard worms, sibiglonids. And sibiglonids, when we dissected one, I can't see a digestive system at all. Their heads are embedded in the calcium of the skeleton, and then the threads at the back they use for respiration, but they have no digestive system to speak of. Instead, they have something called a trophosome, and this trophosome is a special modification of their gut, and it contains a whole lot of bacteria. So what I think is happening is that the sibiglonid worms, the beard worms, are utilizing symbiotic bacteria to make food for them. So the worms get energy, the bacteria get a place to live and protection. So this seems to be a nice mutualistic relationship. Spoonworms, family Echiuridae, these are sedentary ins, but they're not sedentary in that they spend their whole life in one place. They're capable of movement. And I call them spoonworms because this proboscis at the end of their body looks exactly like the spoons we use in 3020. These spoonworms have, like I said, a extensible proboscis, and it's covered with mucus and cilia. Anything that lands here gets funneled into their mouth. So we've seen this pattern before. There are several interesting features of the spoonworms, though. They don't have respiratory organs to speak of, but they have a complete digestive system. And at their posterior portion, you see these extra sacs-like things here. I hypothesize that these are respiratory sacs. So if you think about a sea anemone having an incomplete digestive system, everything is in and then out, and the gastrovascular cavity is a place for digestion and respiration and reproduction. In flatworms, the respiratory organs are still diffused across the surface, but it seems like in spoonworms, the respiratory organs have become modified from the hind end. In humans, the respiratory organs are modified from the front end. But spoonworms apparently breathe through their butts. This is the largest soil worm that we've discovered so far. After the botanist told me that they were plentiful in the moist forest to the east of us, I went out hunting, and this is what I discovered. Extremely large, uncomfortably large, but still you can see the obvious segmentation, and on something this size I could actually physically feel the setae, the paired epidermal setae on this one. The order Clitellata is named after this saddle-like structure right here that occurs on sexually mature worms. And this is the synapomorphy of order Clitellata. It's going to include soil worms and leeches. This structure is called a clitellum and is important for the reproductive cycle of soil worms. When we look at these soil worms, they don't have the elongate modified bristles and setae that the marine worms have, but this makes sense. I think you could infer why a soil worm that is burrowing under the soil might not want extensive lateral bristles. So that would be a good question to infer for yourself. The external morphology is fairly simple. I've already highlighted the clitellum. These are monoecious creatures, so they have female and male reproductive organs. And their prostomium, which, if you remember, is kind of the head of annelids, usually has a peristomium and an extensible pharynx. No extensible pharynx on the soil worms, and the prostomium is also highly reduced. Their paired epidermal setae are connected with a lot of muscles, and this actually allows them to anchor themselves into the soil. So as they burrow, They can contract their circular and longitudinal muscles and modify their body shape, but then they can also anchor themselves into the soil with their setae. This kind of prevents them from being pulled out and helps them burrow further into the soil. Inside, they have a fairly complex circulatory system. It's a closed system, so they have aortic arches similar to our heart, and they pump blood both through a dorsal and ventral blood vessel. Their intestine traverses every segment, and their intestine has the mouth and then the pharynx, and then it has a crop for food storage and a gizzard. The gizzard is a highly muscular organ. It's quite obvious when you press it that it's highly muscularized, and this I think is for crunching, mashing, mechanically digesting the food. So the food will go into the mouth through the pharynx and then be stored in the crop, crushed in the gizzard, and then the intestine lasts through the whole rest of the body, and that's where nutrients are absorbed. You have both female and male reproductive organs, and seminal vesicles are where the sperm will be stored prior to transferring them down the seminal tubules to the female. If we look at a cross-section of the earthworm, specifically I want to point out their digestive system. They have something called a typhlosole, which is this extra little surface area increasing indentation into their intestine. So I think the purpose of this is just to increase the surface area for nutrient absorption, make absorbing nutrients more efficient and faster. We also, surrounding the intestine, we have this ring of chlorogogen cells, and chlorogogen cells seem to be very good for synthesizing fat and glycerol storage, and then they actually break off, detach from the intestinal wall, and transport nutrients throughout the worm's body. So they're almost a little nutrient delivery system. Osmoregulation is going to occur on every segment individually. Every segment is going to have a nephridia pore, out of which they're going to secrete the metabolic wastes and ions or water. And in the anterior portion, so the anterior segment past where the nephridia pore is, there's going to be a ciliated funnel called a nephrostome. And they actually filter the hemolymph from the anterior segment, the segment most anterior to them. The ions are going to flow in and water's going to flow in. Ions will be reabsorbed in the nephric tubules, and we can see the capillary network here. This is going to help filter the blood as it gets as the wastes are removed. The bladder is going to store things, and then it's going to be secreted out the nephridia pore. Soil worm reproduction occurs at night, as far as we can tell. They're usually active during the night rather than the day, primarily because they have to have a very moist skin, otherwise they'll dry out. So at night, during mating season, they will poke the little heads out of the soil, look around like a little periscope, trying to find a mate. If there's not another soil worm around, they'll duck back in. That way they always remain hidden. If they poke their little heads out and there's another soil worm nearby, they will get together, adhere with a mucus secretion, and anchor their setae into each other's sides, and then they cross-fertilize. So first what happens is the clitellum is going to secrete a mucus that adheres them together. The soil worms will cross-fertilize. The testes are going to produce the sperm. The sperm duct will transfer the sperm into the seminal receptacle of the other worm, and then the clitellum is going to secrete a kind of a mucus cocoon-like thing. It's going to be covered in chitin, and as it travels down, it's going to receive the sperm from the seminal receptacle, the eggs from the oviduct, and mix them all together inside the cocoon. So fertilization happens inside the cocoon. The cocoon then slips off, and the ends close up, and you have developing little baby worms inside a cocoon. The little egg casing looks like this. Most of them are very small, but one we found is about 10 times the size of normal, and I have no idea how gigantic these worms on this planet can be. But if this is 10 times as big as that one I showed you, that's a monstrous earthworm, soil worm, because we're not on Earth. During my time in the woods, I also encountered these interesting creatures that seemed at first to take a liking to my rubber wetsuit. But then, after I removed my wetsuit, I realized they were not after the rubber, they were after my flesh and blood. These I'm calling leeches. They are different from soil worms in that they don't have internal septa. So instead, they have a highly muscular body with usually an anterior and posterior sucker, and then they have these sharp teeth that they use to rip into their prey. They must secrete some type of numbing chemical, or a neuron desensitizer, and for sure an anticoagulant. I didn't feel them on me, and the blood flowed extremely quickly and until I pulled them off. So anticoagulant secretions and some type of neuron inhibitor. So pretty remarkable chemical properties of these animals. Leeches seem to be predatory or parasitic, so I'm placing them in family Hyrudinidae. The parasitic ones I just showed you, here's a predatory a predatory leech here, eating one of our precious little soil worms. So they can ingest prey almost as large as themselves, and the moist tropical environment here has numerous different species of them. Here you can see the razor-sharp teeth. They usually have 3 plates that interlock and then together cut a severe hole into their prey, and then they slurp up the blood. What's kind of interesting about these animals is that it seems to be an evolution into parasitism from a free-living form. So I think their ancestors were free-living, and I think that because we can still see the segments on these leeches, but inside they have no septa. Rather, their body cavity is hollow, and I think this allows them to just engorge themselves on a blood meal for a long time, and so they can swell many times their own size if they're filled with blood. But their internal digestive system is somewhat strange. They don't have the necessary enzymes. They don't have the necessary enzymes to actually digest the blood. So it's a very inefficient process for them. They have to rely on bacteria to do the work for them. So it doesn't seem to be an ancestral characteristics for them. They don't seem to be all that well designed for parasitism. They reproduce quite similarly to soil worms. They're going to cross-fertilize each other. They're monoecious individuals. But some, in contrast to the soil worms, actually show some egg masses in their body. So I think there's some type of paternal care within leeches. So even though they're parasites, they still love their babies. One of the crew brought up from the ocean this bucket of creatures. This is, on the surface, they look very annelid-like. They seem to have segments, but one interesting thing about them is their respiratory pigment is not hemoglobin like it is in humans. It's hemocyanin, which is a blue respiratory pigment, so that's why they have a purplish color. But on looking at these, they don't have internal body segments, so they don't have any septa dividing their body segments. Neither do they have paired epidermal setae. So these are not true annelids. These are sipunculans, and so right now I don't really know where to put them. I'll just put them in their own phylum, Phylum Sipuncula. So not in Annelida because they don't have the synapomorphies of Annelida. That's all for today. We learned about annelids, segmented worms, both marine and terrestrial forms, and I'm looking forward to talking with you tomorrow. End of transmission.